All right, so welcome back to the deep dive, everybody.
Yeah.
For another, deep dive, as always.
Another deep dive.
Into some fascinating material. This time, you guys sent in excerpts from ISO 31000.2019 Risk Management Guidelines Pritesh Biswas, which I gotta say, when I first saw that, I was like, really, risk management? That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, digging into this stuff with you has been eye-opening, to say the least. It's not just about corporate boardrooms and spreadsheets.
Yeah.
There's some really powerful ideas here that can apply to pretty much any area of life where you're dealing with uncertainty. So that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Yeah, I think when you think about ISO 31000.2019, as you said, it's easy to think about, boardrooms and complex spreadsheets. But the real strength of these guidelines is how adaptable they are.
Yeah.
They can provide that structure for, anybody from someone who's mapping out, their career path all the way up to multinational companies setting their long-term vision.
Yeah.
So it's really about, how to better understand and navigate those unknowns in your life.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to try to make click for you today in this episode.
Absolutely.
Going through these excerpts, seeing if we can extract the core ideas here and really show you how grasping these principles can make you a better decision maker and more resilient to, whatever life throws at you. So with that said, why don't we jump right in?
Let's do it.
First thing we got to tackle is defining risk.
Okay.
Now, the definition provided in ISO 31000.2018 might actually make you rethink what risk really means.
Okay.
It says that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So I'm curious right off the bat, what stands out to you about that phrasing?
Well, I think what's immediately striking is how broad that definition is.
Yeah.
It's not just focused on potential negative outcomes.
Right.
The effect of uncertainty can be positive as well as negative.
Yeah.
So, a risk isn't solely a threat.
Mm-hmm.
It could also be an unexpected opportunity that you might miss if you're not looking at the full picture of uncertainty.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, we're so conditioned to think of risk as this negative thing, the risk of something bad happening.
Yeah.
But this definition really expands that to say no. Risk is really just the uncertainty, how certain are you about the outcomes?
Right.
And the effect could be good or bad. And it's interesting that the source also mentions that this kind of goal-oriented perspective aligns with the more traditional view of risk, which is the likelihood of an event multiplied by its impact.
Yeah.
It's almost like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
One's focusing on the event, the other one's focusing on the goal.
Yeah, and I think the goal-oriented perspective of ISO 31000 really underscores that vital connection between risk and what you're actually trying to achieve your objectives. Right? Risk only exists in relation to you accomplishing something.
Right.
As the text points out, it's essentially uncertainty that matters.
Yeah.
Because it has the potential to impact whether or not you succeed.
Right.
And that impact could be good or bad.
Yeah, so for our listeners out there thinking about their careers right now, this might mean not just preparing for potential setbacks like getting laid off or, your company going under, but also maybe considering the risk of not upskilling in a rapidly changing job market.
Absolutely.
Even if you feel relatively secure.
Yeah.
Because if your goal is long-term career growth and you're not keeping your skills up to date, that's a risk.
Absolutely.
Right.
Because it has the potential to impact you negatively.
Exactly. And the source also talks about the importance of having, clear and well-defined objectives.
Yeah.
Like having goals that are specific and measurable.
Right.
Achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Absolutely.
It seems like that's kind of step one.
Foundational.
To even think about risk.
Yeah. I think if your goals are hazy or ill-defined, it's going to be almost impossible to identify and assess the uncertainties that could help you reach those goals.
Right.
Or knock you off course.
Yeah, if you don't know where you're going,
yeah,
any road will get you there.
Exactly.
But you might not end up where you want to be. So,
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've kind of got a grip on, what risk is according to this ISO standard.
Okay.
But the next question is so what? Why should we even bother with this whole risk management thing? The excerpts lay out a pretty extensive list of benefits.
Yeah.
And it's not just about avoiding those worst case scenarios. There's more to it than that.
Yeah. If we think about the big picture, Effective risk management increases your chances of actually achieving your objectives, right? It encourages a proactive mindset so you can anticipate potential issues and opportunities rather than just reacting to them after they've happened.
Like being on the front foot instead of the back foot.
Exactly. It also sharpens your ability to identify both potential threats and those often overlooked opportunities. And beyond that, it strengthens governance. Provides a framework for making informed decisions. Boosts stakeholder confidence by demonstrating that responsible approach enhances overall organizational resilience and can even lead to improvements in operational efficiency.
Wow.
So it's really about creating and protecting value.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
So it sounds like it's not just about preventing bad things.
Right.
It's also about positioning yourself to capitalize on good things.
Absolutely.
When they come up.
Exactly.
Now, one of the things that really stood out to me about this whole ISO standard thing was the emphasis on the fact that it's applicable to anyone. Like, this is not just for Fortune 500 companies with, like, risk management departments.
It's for everyone.
This is for, like, me and you and our listeners. Like, anyone can use this stuff.
Absolutely. Individuals, families, teams, organizations of all sizes, government bodies.
Wow.
Regardless of their sector or scale.
But, like, if I'm just a regular person trying to plan my personal finances, I can use these principles.
Absolutely.
Or if me and my friends are planning a trip together. We can use these principles.
You're managing logistical and interpersonal risks.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
It's everywhere.
That's so cool.
Right.
And the source even says, like, while the guidelines are universal, the way you apply them obviously needs to be tailored
Absolutely.
to your own specific needs and the context.
Right.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all.
No, it's a framework.
Yeah.
Right? A way of thinking.
A set of principles.
Right, a structured approach.
Yeah. But then you customize it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're on the same page about what risk is.
Okay.
Why it's important to manage it.
Yeah.
And that it's for everyone.
Right.
Now let's get into some of the nitty-gritty details here. The excerpts lay out a bunch of key terms in Section 3.
All right.
Now, they might sound a little technical at first.
Sure.
But it's really important to understand these basic building blocks if you're going to actually use this framework. So we already talked about risk.
Sure.
What about risk management?
All right, so risk management, as defined by these guidelines, encompasses the coordinated activities to direct and control an organization regarding risk.
Okay, so it's like the whole system.
The system, the process.
The process that you put in place to deal with uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. What about the term stakeholder?
Okay.
Now, in the context of risk management, who are we talking about when we say stakeholder?
So a stakeholder is defined very broadly as anyone who can be affected by or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity.
Okay, so that's pretty broad.
It's very broad.
It's not just like the people in the boardroom making the decisions. It's anyone who might feel the impact.
Exactly. And this is really encouraging a wide lens when you're considering who has an interest in what you're doing.
Right.
And whose perspective might be valuable.
Right.
In understanding and managing those potential risks.
So for a company launching a new product, stakeholders could be their customer.
Customers, investors, employees, suppliers.
Employees.
Yeah. Even the local community.
Wow. Okay. And then for someone like me planning a career change, stakeholders could be my family.
Your family, mentors, your future self.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you're a stakeholder in your own future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so stakeholders, it's a big tent.
Big tent.
What about risk source?
Okay.
What are we talking about there?
A risk source is anything that has the potential to give rise to risk.
Okay, so like what? Kind of give me an example.
It could be a tangible thing, like a piece of equipment that might fail.
Okay.
Or a process that has vulnerabilities built into it.
Yeah.
Human behavior.
Okay.
That could lead to errors, or even an external factor like a shift in the economy.
Okay, so it's basically like the thing that the risk comes from.
It's the origin.
The origin, yeah, okay.
Basis.
And then event seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, an event is simply an occurrence or change of a particular set of circumstances.
So something happens.
Something happens.
Right.
A change occurs.
Could be planned. Could be unplanned.
Right. It could be you launching a marketing campaign.
Yeah.
Or a sudden market downturn.
Yeah. And events can have positive or negative consequences.
Absolutely.
Right.
Which brings us to consequence.
Consequence. Okay, so that's the outcome.
The outcome, the result.
The result of the event.
Of the event on your objectives.
And the consequence could be good or bad.
Good or bad. Direct, immediate, or indirect long-term.
So like a successful marketing campaign,
Mm-hmm.
that's the event.
The event.
The consequence could be increased sales?
Increased sales, brand awareness,
Yeah.
customer loyalty.
Cool. Okay, so we got event, we got consequence.
Got consequence.
What about likelihood? So likelihood is basically just the chance of something happening.
Yeah, the chance of something happening, the probability
The probability.
of a specific event or a particular consequence occurring.
Okay, cool. So like how likely is it that this thing is going to happen?
Exactly. And that often involves looking at, historical data, expert opinions, current conditions.
Like making an educated guess.
Right.
Based on what,
Exactly.
Okay, last term I think is control.
Right.
What is a control in this context?
A control is any measure that is in place to maintain and or modify risk.
Okay.
So it's something you implement to reduce the likelihood of a negative risk occurring or decrease its impact if it does occur.
Okay.
Or to increase the likelihood and positive impact of a beneficial risk.
So it's like the things you do to either prevent bad stuff from happening
Right.
or to make good stuff more likely to happen.
Exactly. So things like safety procedures, backup systems, or even having a diverse investment portfolio.
Oh, okay. So those are all controls.
Those are all controls.
Okay, cool. So we've got our terminology down.
Yeah.
Those are like the basic building blocks.
The foundation.
The foundation, yeah.
Mhm.
Now, the excerpts go on to outline what they call the principles of ISO 31000.2018.
Right.
There's 8 of these principles.
8 principles.
And they offer some really practical guidance for actually using this framework.
Okay.
So let's go through them one by one.
Let's do it.
The first principle is that risk management should be integrated.
Okay.
So what does that mean in practice?
Integrated means that risk management is not a separate function.
Okay.
It's woven into all the organization's activities, becoming a natural part of decision-making.
At every level.
At every level across all departments.
Okay, so it's not like a separate department.
Right.
It's like everyone's thinking about risk.
Everyone is thinking about risk.
As they do their work.
As they do their work.
Okay, and for, an individual, that means thinking about risk not as an afterthought,
Right.
but as like a fundamental part of whatever you're doing.
Okay.
Baked in from the beginning.
Baked in.
Yeah.
Okay, principle number 2.
Number 2.
Risk management should be structured and comprehensive.
Okay.
Why is it so important to have a systematic approach?
Well, a structured and comprehensive approach makes sure that you're looking at risk methodically and consistently.
Yeah.
You're not just addressing issues randomly as they pop up.
Putting out fires.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And this leads to more reliable and comparable results across different situations and over time.
So you're not reinventing the wheel every time you encounter a new risk.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. The third principle is customized.
Okay.
We kind of touched on this earlier, but it bears repeating.
Yeah.
The way you manage risk has to be tailored to your specific context.
Your specific context and objectives.
Yeah.
What might be a huge risk for one person might be totally irrelevant for someone else.
Yeah, and your risk management system should reflect that.
Reflect that, absolutely.
Okay, principle number 4 is inclusive.
So this is about involving stakeholders in the process.
Yes.
Why is that so important?
Well, involving stakeholders brings in a wider range of knowledge, different perspectives, and perceptions of risk.
Yeah.
This can lead to a more thorough and nuanced understanding of potential uncertainties.
So it's like getting a second opinion?
Multiple opinions.
Multiple opinions, yeah.
And it can lead to much more informed and effective risk management decisions.
Like if I'm thinking about making a big career change, I should probably talk to my family.
Talk to your family, talk to mentors.
Get their perspectives.
Get those perspectives.
Because they might see things that I don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
That's inclusive.
Principle number 5 is dynamic.
Okay.
So this is acknowledging that the world is constantly changing.
The world is constantly changing.
Things are in flux.
In flux, absolutely. Risks aren't static.
Right.
They emerge. They evolve. They can even disappear as the environment changes.
Yeah. So your risk management system
needs to be agile, adaptable.
Can't just be like set in stone.
Set in stone, you need to adjust.
Got to be able to move with the changes.
Move with the changes, right?
Okay, cool. Principle number 6.
Number 6.
Is using the best available information.
Okay.
So this is about making decisions based on the data you have,
right,
but also being aware of the limitations of that data.
Absolutely.
So you might not have perfect information.
You rarely do.
But you use the best you got.
Use the best available information.
Right.
So that means looking at past experiences, industry trends,
expert forecasts,
but
also being aware that those things,
they're not perfect.
They're not gospel.
They're not gospel.
They're not guaranteed to be true.
Right.
So you have to make decisions with that humility in mind.
With that humility in mind.
Oh, okay, cool. Preamble number 7 is human and cultural factors.
Okay.
This one's interesting.
It is interesting.
Because it's acknowledging that risk management isn't just about systems and processes.
Not just numbers.
It's about people.
It's about people.
And how they behave.
So
things like biases and motivations and the culture of the organization can all have a huge impact. On how risks are managed.
Absolutely.
So if you have a culture where people are afraid to speak up about potential problems.
Yeah, that's a problem.
That's a problem.
That's a huge risk.
That's a risk in itself.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then the final principle number 8 is continual improvement.
Okay.
So this is about learning from experience and adapting over time.
Right. So risk management isn't a one-time exercise.
Right.
It's an ongoing journey.
Yeah, it's not like you do it once and then you're done.
You're done. You set it and forget it.
Yeah.
No, you got to constantly review, improve based on lessons learned.
Yeah.
Feedback received, changes in the environment.
Like the PDCA cycle.
Exactly, the PDCA cycle.
Plan, do, check, act.
Plan, do, check, act.
Keep going around and around.
Around and around.
Always learning, always getting better.
Always improving.
Okay, cool. So those are the 8 principles.
The 8 principles.
Of ISO 31000.2018.
Right.
Now let's talk about how organizations actually put this into practice.
Okay.
The source talks about building a framework. For managing risk. So what is a risk management framework?
A risk management framework is essentially how you integrate risk management into the core activities and fundamental functions of an organization.
Okay.
It establishes those essential foundations in organizational arrangements for, effectively designing, implementing, monitoring, reviewing, and continually improving risk management practices.
So it's like the blueprint.
It is the blueprint for how an organization will manage risk.
Okay. And the source really stresses the importance of leadership.
Absolutely.
Like top-down commitment from the very top.
Yeah, this is not something you can delegate to a lower level team.
Right.
And then forget about it.
Yeah.
Senior management needs to be actively championing risk management.
Yeah.
They got to tailor that framework to their specific context, establish clear policies, allocate the necessary resources, and assign clear responsibilities and accountabilities.
So it's like they have to walk the walk.
Walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Not just talk the talk. Yeah. And that helps to ensure that everyone in the organization understands how important this stuff is.
Understands the importance.
And they also have to make sure that the framework is actually aligned with the organization's goals.
Yes.
And their values.
It can't be at odds with the big picture.
Right. It has to be part of the DNA of the company.
Part of the DNA.
And they also need to make sure that everyone understands the level of risk.
The level of risk.
That the organization is willing to accept.
Yeah. What's their risk appetite?
Right. What's their risk tolerance?
Yeah.
Like, how much risk are we comfortable with? And the source talks about the importance of integration.
Okay.
So actually embedding risk management into the organization's structure.
Right.
The governance, the strategy.
The operations.
It's not a separate thing.
It's not a silo.
It's part of everything.
It's part of everything.
And that means everyone has a role to play.
Everyone.
Right. From the CEO all the way down.
All the way down.
Okay. And then there's the design phase of the framework.
All right.
So this is where you really have to understand the organization.
Understand the organization and its environment. The context.
Yeah. So what kind of things are we looking at here?
So externally, you're looking at, the social, cultural, political, legal, regulatory, financial.
Wow. This is a lot.
It is a lot. Technological, economic, and environmental landscape, both locally and globally.
Okay.
You're also looking at key trends, relationships with external stakeholders, and any contractual obligations.
Wow. So it's like painting a picture of the whole world.
Absolutely. The organization lives in.
The world that the organization operates in.
Yeah. And then internally.
Internally, you're looking at the vision, mission, and values. The governance structure.
Strategy.
The culture.
The resources.
The resources, the capabilities.
It's the systems.
And then the relationships with internal stakeholders. So it's like taking an X-ray of the company.
Exactly.
Like seeing how everything works.
How everything fits together.
Yeah, okay. And then the framework has to actually articulate the organization's commitment
Their commitment.
to risk management.
Right.
So this is about putting it in writing.
Putting it in writing, having clear policies.
Yeah.
Communicating it effectively.
So it's not just like a handshake agreement.
Right. It's got to be official.
It's got to be official.
Got to be documented.
Documented. Yeah. Okay.
And then you need to assign clear roles, authorities, responsibilities, accountabilities related to risk management.
Like who's doing what?
Who's doing what?
Who's responsible for what?
Exactly.
And then you actually have to provide the resources.
To make it happen.
Right. The processes, the tools, the information systems.
It's all got to be there.
It's got to be there.
Or else it's just words on a page.
Just words.
Yeah. And then finally, the design phase includes establishing clear communication and consultation processes.
Absolutely.
With all the stakeholders.
You got to keep everyone in the loop.
Yeah.
Make sure that information about risks is shared effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And that feedback is actively sought and taken into account.
So it's a two-way street.
Two-way street.
It's not just top-down.
Right.
It's like everyone's talking to each other.
Everyone's talking. Okay, so that's the framework.
The framework, the structure, the commitment.
Foundation.
The foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk about the actual process.
The process.
Of managing risk.
Okay.
So the source calls this the risk management process.
Right.
They describe it as a systematic application.
Yeah.
Systematic application.
Of those policies and procedures that we just talked about.
That we just talked about within that framework.
So what are the core stages of this process?
Right. So the risk management process is often depicted as a linear sequence of steps.
Okay.
But in reality, it's more iterative and cyclical.
Okay.
But the key stages include communication and consultation, defining the scope, context, and criteria.
Okay.
Risk assessment, which includes risk identification, risk analysis, and risk valuation.
Okay.
Risk treatment, monitoring, and review, and recording and reporting.
Okay, cool. So let's start with communication and consultation.
Okay.
It seems like that's like a recurring theme throughout this whole thing.
It is a recurring theme.
Yeah.
It's fundamental.
Yeah.
At every stage.
So why is it so important?
Effective communication and consultation ensures that all individuals involved or affected by risk management, they have a clear understanding of the basis on which decisions are being made and the reasoning behind specific risk management actions.
So it's about transparency and making sure everyone's on the same page.
On the same page, absolutely.
Okay, and the source mentions all sorts of different methods for communication.
Right.
From formal meetings to informal discussions to online platforms.
Online platforms, reports, email.
Yeah, it's basically like whatever works.
Whatever works.
Okay, next stage is scope, context, and criteria.
Okay.
So why is it so important to define these right at the beginning?
Well, defining the scope sets the boundaries for what you're actually examining.
Okay.
So, what are your objectives? What decisions are you considering? What outcomes are you hoping for? What's the time frame?
So it's like drawing a box around the problem.
Drawing a box.
Yeah.
And then understanding that external and internal context.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
We did.
That's like the backdrop.
The backdrop.
That's the environment you're operating in.
Absolutely.
And then defining risk criteria.
Risk criteria.
What's that about?
So that's about establishing benchmarks you'll use to evaluate the significance of risks.
Okay.
So you determine how much risk is acceptable, your risk appetite, risk tolerance. And these criteria help you decide if a risk is acceptable and how it compares to other risks.
Yeah.
Taking into account not just the impact,
right,
but also factors like sustainability and stakeholder views.
So it's like setting your standards.
Setting your standards.
Like, what are we willing to put up with?
Exactly.
What are we not willing to put up with?
What are we not willing to put up with?
Yeah. Okay, so now we get into the heart of the process.
The heart of it.
Which is risk assessment.
All right.
And risk assessment has 3 parts.
3 parts.
Risk identification.
Risk analysis.
And risk evaluation.
Evaluation.
So let's start with risk identification.
Okay.
What's involved in actually identifying potential risks?
So risk identification is about finding, recognizing, and describing all potential risks, both positive and negative, that might affect your objectives.
So it's like a brainstorming session.
Brainstorming. You're asking questions like, what could happen?
Yeah.
How could it happen?
Where could it happen?
Where could it happen? Why might it happen? What could be the consequences? You got to consider all potential sources of uncertainty.
Both good and bad.
both good and bad.
Okay.
There are causes and there are consequences.
Yeah, and then who might be able to influence the outcome?
Who can influence it?
And who's responsible for managing it?
Who's the risk owner?
The risk, okay, so that's risk identification.
That's identification.
Now we move on to risk analysis. Assessment is a process, and it's got these 3 core stages. First, you've got to figure out what could possibly go wrong. That's risk identification. Then you dig deeper. You try to understand how bad those things could actually be and how likely they are to happen. That's risk analysis. And then based on all that, you decide what you're going to do about it, if anything. That's risk evaluation.
Okay, so 3 stages. Identify, analyze, evaluate. Makes sense. So let's start with that first step, risk identification. What's the main goal here?
It's all about finding, recognizing, and clearly describing the risks that could impact whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And here's the thing. We're not just talking about the negative stuff, the potential problems. We're also looking for potential upsides, the opportunities that uncertainty can create.
Oh, that's interesting. We usually think of risk as a bad thing, but you're saying it's broader than that.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that not taking a risk can also be a risk in itself. Think about the potential for missed opportunities if you play it too safe. So when we're identifying risks, we ask some key questions. What could happen? Good or bad? How could it happen? Where? Why? What could the consequences be?
Okay, so it's about really getting specific, pinning down those potential issues.
Yeah, and another crucial question, who can actually influence the outcome? And who is ultimately responsible for managing that specific risk? They're called the risk owner. Now, BSWAS also emphasizes considering all sorts of factors, both tangible things like physical assets and intangible things like reputation.
So we're casting a wide net here.
We are. You need to think about what might trigger these risks, the root causes, and the specific events that could occur. You got to consider threats and opportunities, weaknesses you need to address, and strengths you can leverage. Changes in your situation or the wider environment, those are huge. And any early warning signs that new risks might be popping up, those are crucial too. And of course, understanding what you value most your assets and what could happen if they're affected. That's fundamental.
So it's a really thorough internal and external scan looking at all the things that could affect your goals.
It is. And we also need to be honest with ourselves. Our knowledge isn't perfect. We might not have all the information, and the information we do have might not be completely accurate. And time plays a role too. What's a major risk today might be less of a concern down the road. And, you know, we've all got our own biases, our individual perspectives. Those can definitely color how we see and identify risks.
Right. Our own preconceived notions can really shape things.
They really can. And once you've identified a risk, you've got to figure out what you're already doing to manage it. What controls are in place. Things like safety protocols, security measures, those kinds of things.
Okay, so we've spotted the risks. We've described them. We've noted any existing safeguards. What's next?
That brings us to stage 2, risk analysis. And this is where we roll up our sleeves and really dig deep. We want to understand the nature of each risk, its specific characteristics, and where possible, figure out the level of risk. That usually means figuring out how bad the consequences could be and how likely they are to happen. It's about moving beyond just saying, oh, this is bad, and getting into the specifics. How bad? How often?
So we're thinking about both severity and probability.
You got it. And risk analysis, this involves looking at all the uncertainties, the possible causes, the potential consequences, how likely those consequences are, what events could trigger them, different scenarios that could play out, and really importantly, how well your existing controls are actually working. And remember, one event can have multiple causes, and it can lead to a whole bunch of different consequences.
All right, it's all connected. And I see this analysis can be qualitative, quantitative, or a mix of both. What does that look like in practice?
So qualitative analysis might describe the likelihood as, low, medium, or high, and the impact as, say, minor, significant, or major. But with quantitative analysis, you try to put numbers on it. Maybe there's a 10% chance of a $1 million loss or something like that. Often, using both approaches gives you the most complete picture.
Interesting. So what are some key things to think about during this analysis phase?
Well, BSWAS points out a few really important ones. First, the likelihood of the events and the nature and scale of the consequences, those are obviously key. You also need to consider how complex the risk is and how it might connect to other risks. Then there's the time factor, how might this risk change over time, and how effective are your current controls, really. Finally, you've got to think about how sensitive your analysis is to different assumptions and how confident you are in the data you're using.
So you're building a detailed profile of each risk, almost like a fingerprint.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, those consequences, they can be wide-ranging and they can change over time. What might start as a minor technical glitch could snowball into a major outage if it's not dealt with quickly. And you got to remember, multiple things can lead to the same outcome, and one event could trigger a whole chain reaction of consequences.
Now, you mentioned controls earlier, and BSWAS breaks them down into 3 categories: preventative, detective, and corrective. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. Preventative controls are all about stopping a risk from happening in the first place. Think clear policies and procedures requiring approvals before key decisions are made, having strong security protocols, providing thorough training, that kind of thing. The idea is to address those root causes head on.
So if you can stop the problem before it starts, that's ideal, right?
It is. But we also know that we can't prevent everything. So that's where detective controls come in. They're designed to catch a risk event or a failure if and when it happens. So think regular performance reviews, reconciling your accounts, audits, investigations after an incident, those kinds of things. They don't stop the risk itself, but they let you know when something's not right.
Okay, so preventative is about stopping it. Detective is about spotting it. What about corrective controls?
These are your damage control measures. They kick in after a risk event has already happened to try to minimize the impact. So things like crisis management plans, business continuity plans, insurance disaster recovery procedures, that kind of thing. They're all about reducing the harm once something has already gone wrong.
So it's a layered approach: prevent, detect, minimize. Got it.
Yeah.
Now, you said the effectiveness of these controls is really important. It's not just about having them in place. It's about making sure they actually work right.
Yeah, exactly. BSWAS points out a bunch of things to consider here. You got to understand how a control is actually supposed to reduce the risk. Is it capable of doing what it's designed to do and getting the results you expect? Are there any weaknesses in the design or how it's being used? Are there gaps in your overall system of controls? Do different controls work independently, or do they rely on each other? And are there any external factors that could weaken them or even completely negate their effectiveness?
And I guess adding a new control could sometimes create a whole new set of problems, right?
Oh, yeah, all the time. You try to fix one thing and you accidentally create 3 more issues. It's like that old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. For example, you might add a complicated approval process to reduce the risk of errors, but then it slows everything down, people get frustrated, and they might try to bypass the system altogether. So you always have to think about those unintended consequences.
BSWAS is also really big on validating our assumptions about how well our controls are actually working. Why is that so important?
Because more often than not, things go wrong, not because there were no controls, but because the controls that were in place just didn't work the way they were supposed to. You might assume your security system is top-notch, but you don't really know until it's been tested or you've reviewed its performance history. It's about moving beyond just having controls to actively checking if they're doing their job.
And we also talked about how our own perspectives and the quality of information can affect our analysis.
Totally. Our individual views on risk, any biases we have, the judgments we make, those can all skew the analysis. And if the data we're using is inaccurate or outdated, our analysis is going to be flawed. We also need to be aware of any limitations in the methods we're using. All these things need to be acknowledged and addressed as much as possible.
Okay, so we've identified the risks, we've analyzed them looking at likelihood and impact, we've considered our controls. That leads us to risk evaluation. What's the main objective here?
It's decision time. This is where we take everything we've learned and start figuring out what to do. We compare the results of our risk analysis with whatever risk criteria we've established to decide if a risk is acceptable or tolerable, or if we need to take action to reduce it. It's all about answering the question, can we live with this risk, or do we need to do something about it?
So it's a judgment call based on all the information we've gathered.
Right. And things like ethical considerations, legal requirements, financial implications, how stakeholders perceive the risk. All those things come into play. Based on the evaluation, we might decide to just accept the risk, explore different ways to treat it, do more analysis if there are still a lot of unknowns, keep our existing controls, or even rethink our original goals if the risks are just too high.
And how do we determine if a risk is acceptable or tolerable? What are some guidelines for that?
BSWAS lays out a few situations where accepting the risk might be the right call. Maybe there's just no realistic way to reduce it, or the cost of doing so would be way more than the potential benefit. A risk might also be acceptable if it's inherently low and doesn't justify spending time and resources to treat it.
Hmm.
Or maybe the potential rewards are so great that they outweigh the potential downsides. And sometimes an organization might just consciously decide to accept a certain level of risk as part of doing business.
So it's about weighing the pros and cons and making a calculated decision. It's not just about the numbers, though, right?
No way.
Yeah.
There are other things that come into play, like the absolute worst case scenario, how effective our current controls are, the qualitative aspects of the risk, what our stakeholders think, and how practical and costly further risk reduction would be. And importantly, we need to think about how different risks interact. Addressing one risk might create or worsen another.
And whatever we decide in this evaluation stage, it's important to document it, share it with everyone involved, and validate it. Why is that so crucial?
Well, documentation creates a clear record of what we thought and the decisions we made. Communication makes sure everyone's on the same page about the risks and the outcomes of the evaluation. And validation, particularly at the right levels, ensures that the evaluation was done properly and the decisions are sound. And Biswas points out that risk assessment isn't a one-time thing. After we've decided on treatments, we should ideally go back and reassess to make sure those treatments haven't accidentally created new risks and that the remaining level of risk is still within our acceptable limits.
Okay, so we've identified, analyzed, and evaluated the risks. Now we get to the action part, risk treatment.
That's right. This is where we pick and choose what we're actually going to do to address the risks. We're trying to change the likelihood of the risk happening, the consequences if it does happen, or both. It's often an iterative process, meaning we go through several cycles of selecting, implementing, and checking the effectiveness of those treatments.
And what are some key considerations when choosing how to treat a risk? What do we need to keep in mind?
We need to weigh the pros and cons of each option. The costs, the resources needed, any potential downsides or new risks it could create. Biswas points out that often the best approach is to use a combination of different strategies. Some common options include avoiding the risk altogether, accepting it, removing the source, trying to reduce the likelihood of it happening, or minimizing the impact if it does happen.
And there's risk sharing too, right? Like using insurance or contracts. But you mentioned that even if you share the risk, you still have responsibility to manage it.
That's a really important point. Sharing the risk can help reduce the financial burden or the operational burden, but you're still ultimately responsible for overseeing and managing the situation. Another option is simply accepting the risk and deciding to live with it, but that should be a conscious and informed decision. If you want to lower the chances of a risk happening, you need to address the root causes. If you want to minimize the impact, you might develop contingency plans. And if a risk is particularly significant, you might even consider changing the scope or design of your project or activity to eliminate the risk entirely.
So there are a lot of different tools in the risk management toolbox. And the reasons for choosing a particular approach, they go beyond just money, right?
Absolutely. You need to consider your obligations, any commitments you've made, the perspectives of your stakeholders. And when you're deciding how to treat a risk, it's essential to think about stakeholder values, how they might be affected, and how to communicate and consult with them effectively. As we discussed earlier, even the best plans can go awry or create new unforeseen risks. So it's critical to monitor and review the effectiveness of your risk treatments. And if it turns out there aren't any suitable treatments or the ones you've implemented aren't doing enough to reduce the risk, you still need to keep that risk on your radar and review it regularly. Everyone needs to be aware of the risk that remains, even after treatment.
So once we've picked our treatments, how do we actually put them into action?
That's where treatment plans come in. The purpose is to lay out exactly how those chosen actions will be implemented and to track progress. A good treatment plan should explain why those specific treatments were chosen, who's responsible for carrying them out, what specific actions they need to take, what resources they'll need, including backups, how you'll measure success, any limitations or assumptions you're making, how you'll report progress and monitor effectiveness, and a clear timeline.
It's like a blueprint for putting those treatments into practice. And during the implementation phase, what are some key questions we should be asking ourselves?
You need to ask yourself if the treatments are actually going to work. Will they reduce the risk as you expect? Could they create any new risks? Are they practical and cost-effective? Does the benefit of reducing the risk outweigh the cost of implementing the treatment? Even if your existing controls seem to be working well, is there any way to make them even stronger? The ultimate goal is to make sure the risk that's left over after you've implemented the treatments, what's called residual risk, is lower than the original risk. But even residual risk need to be documented, monitored, and reviewed because you might need further treatment down the road.
Now, we've talked a lot about the different steps involved in risk assessment, but it sounds like it's not a one and done kind of thing. There's an ongoing element, monitoring and review. Why is that so important for making sure our risk management stays effective?
Monitoring and review are essential for quality control and continuous improvement. It's about regularly checking if things are going according to plan and making sure our processes, the risks we've identified, the controls we have in place, and the treatments we've implemented are still appropriate and effective. And that means keeping an eye out for any changes in the environment or any new risks that pop up. It's about staying flexible and being ready to adapt.
So this should be a regular part of what we do with clear roles and responsibilities. What kinds of things should we be checking during this monitoring and review process?
Regularly check if the assumptions you made about the uncertainty, risks, and opportunities are still valid. Are you getting the results you expected? Do your risk assessments still line up with what you're actually experiencing? Are you using the right risk assessment methods, and are they working? And most importantly, are your risk treatments actually reducing the risks?
So it's about constantly evaluating and adjusting. And this monitoring and review process involves several steps, right?
Yeah, it includes planning how you'll monitor and review gathering and analyzing relevant information, documenting your findings, and giving feedback. The results of all this should then feed back into your overall performance management and reporting so you can continuously improve your approach.
Now, one theme that's come up throughout our discussion is communication. And Biswas specifically emphasizes the importance of recording and reporting. What are the main reasons for that?
Well, recording and reporting serve several purposes. They help you communicate about your risk management activities and the results across the organization. They provide vital information for decision-making at all levels. They help you improve your processes over time. And they help you engage with stakeholders, including those responsible for managing specific risks.
And what kind of information should be documented and reported? What are some guidelines for that?
It depends on how the information will be used, how sensitive it is, and the overall context. But Biswas is clear that reporting is fundamental to good governance. It promotes transparency and accountability. When deciding what to report, think about the different needs of your stakeholders, the cost, how often you need to report, how quickly the information needs to get to them, the best ways to communicate it, and how relevant it is to your overall goals and decision-making.
And what about keeping records? What's the purpose of that?
Records serve a few key purposes. They communicate risk information to decision makers and stakeholders. They justify the choices you made. They preserve the results of your assessments for future reference. They help you track performance and spot trends. They provide assurance that risks are being managed properly. They allow for verification, and they create a clear audit trail.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from identifying and analyzing risks to evaluating them, implementing treatments, and the importance of ongoing monitoring and review.
And by understanding these core principles, you've got a really powerful framework for navigating uncertainty in all areas of your life. It's not about eliminating risk entirely, which is often impossible, but about making informed decisions and taking proactive steps to manage those uncertainties.
So think about those key stages: identifying, analyzing, evaluating, treating, and continuously monitoring. What's one area in your own life or your work where taking a more structured approach to risk assessment might uncover some hidden insights or even new opportunities? Take some time to reflect on that and think about how you might apply these ideas in a practical way.
And if you're interested in digging deeper into specific risk assessment techniques, or you want to share your own experiences with managing risk, we'd love to hear from you. Maybe those could be topics for future deep dives.
Thanks for joining us for this exploration of risk assessment. We hope you found it valuable. Until next time.
See you then.